Kent Bang. I'm the Director of Swine Lending at Compeer Financial. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started this morning. All the callers are on mute for the duration of the call. We have reserved some time at the end of the presentation, hopefully, for some questions. If you do have questions during the presentation, please utilize the chat function on the webinar, and we will address those questions to Brett as time allows. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive a link email to the recording shortly after the call. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Brett Stuart. Brett is the president of Global Agritrends. The firm was organized in 2006 and provides global agriculture research, analysis, and forecasting to a variety of clients around the world. He was formerly the economist for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. He has conducted numerous research and analysis projects in the global meat trade area, as well as advising government representatives on international trade issues. Brett has conducted on-the-ground meat industry research for a variety of clients on 6 continents, and recently, I think Brett said he'd been to China 3 times this year. Brett was raised on a cattle ranch and also worked as an auditor, market analyst, controller in the agriculture industry. He received his undergraduate degree in accounting at Utah State University and his master's in business administration from the University of Nebraska. Brett, we're very excited to have you here today with us, and welcome, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kent. Appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. It's good to be with you all today. I heard we have a pretty big group out there in the cyber world here. We have a big topic. I hope you're all sharp and ready today, well caffeinated and ready to go. I'm going to be talking about the ASF situation in China today. It's a big story, and it's actually incredible. It's difficult to figure out. It's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, and so we base things on assumptions, and we have some big assumptions we're making on what's going to happen here to the global protein sector from this situation. So to start out, I just wanted to talk for a minute here. Let me make sure I can advance. Hang on just a second. There we go. I've had some debates recently, and I've read some books and information about forecasting, and the debate's this, that the markets are unpredictable, that black swan events are inevitable, and the word unpredictable means unable to predict. And I've got a good friend who's actually a banker, and we have this discussion all the time, that it's a fool's game to try and predict markets, and I have a lot of evidence to support his opinion in that. But we say markets are unpredictable, but there are trends, some trends are unmistakable, and I'm thinking about ASF here. You know, it's a very unpredictable situation. We don't have good data. We're making some big key assumptions, but the question is the future predictable? And I just want you to take a look at this picture for a minute. Right? Some trends are unmistakable, and I don't know who this guy's friend was holding the camera here, but he was a great man to do this for us all and take that picture. And so while, yeah, we may not know exactly how and when and details of things, and markets are unpredictable, there are some trends that are pretty easy to see what's going to happen here in the near future, and I think that's a good intro for African swine fever. So these are just some facts. I think people are fairly well aware of this. African swine fever is the worst hog disease in the world. And the reason is there's no vaccine. It's very high mortality. It's carried by trucks, employees, wild boars. It's carried through pork, on clothing, on feed. In China this last trip, I had some Chinese farmers that were saying they believe it was carried by rats from one farm to another. Farms that are in close proximity, rodents can carry it. They even said flies, blood-sucking flies could transmit it. Now, I haven't seen a lot of research on that, but there were some farmers in China that said that's how we think it's moving, is even by rodents and flies. it's a highly transmissible disease, meaning it's bloodborne, and so a drop of blood would have enough virus to infect potentially thousands of hogs. So it is highly transmissible, but it's not highly contagious, and that's one thing that's important to understand. It's not an airborne disease like, say, PED virus. This is a disease that has to be transmitted bodily fluids, nose to nose, manure, blood. And so a truck doesn't drive down the road past your farm, kick up dust, and infect your hogs with ASF. It's not that kind of disease. And so that changes the equation a little bit. It changes how we think about a potential infection in the U.S. There's no human health risk. The pork is safe to eat. No risk at all. But the reality is there is no vaccine, and that makes it a very difficult situation. The other thing that's important to understand about ASF is it's a very hard virus to kill. The virus is very hardy. It lasts a long time. You can see in this table here, frozen meat, the virus will remain active for up to 1,000 days. I mean, that's almost 3 years in frozen meat. 300 days in dried meat. So you think of dried sausage. I see dried sausage in the convenience stores and the airports in China. I see it all over. And I think that stuff can carry this virus for almost a year. Blood, 15 weeks. Contaminated pig pens, the FAO said 1 month. I think the experience in China is maybe a little longer than that. The Chinese government's requiring farmers wait 6 months before restocking a farm. And so you think about this, like I said, the virus isn't flying through the air, but it's a very hard virus to kill. Pork is important in China. It's important culturally, socially. The Chinese consume 85 pounds per capita, second only, I think, to Europe. It's traditional. Pork was always a sign of prosperity. If you had a few pigs in your yard, you were considered prosperous during the tough times in China. And today that pork is distributed all over China. You can see the picture here, the guy on the scooter. I mean, that is definitely not something we would see in the U.S. today. You can see that in Minneapolis here, a guy on a scooter hauling sides of pork through town. So it's unique. It's different. It's a complex system. It's half of the pigs in the world, the pork is eaten fresh. Most of the pork is eaten warm. It's a warm pork market. That pork's never refrigerated. The pigs are slaughtered in the morning. They're shipped out to markets and consumed that day. Now, there is a growing cold chain. There are supermarkets. That's a growing business, but I would guess that's still less than half of the pork consumption in China that's actually sold through refrigeration. And so very unique situation. Logistically, you think about it, you've got millions of hogs feeding 1 billion people in pieces and parts being transferred all over the country. That complicates the virus. China's 56% of the global swine inventory. And so we're talking about the worst disease in the world and the biggest herd in the world. So it's never a good sign or never a good picture when you see livestock and people in hazmat suits. This was one of the original outbreaks in China. The disease first was reported in China August 3rd, 2018. And so we've had some lead time on this. I think it was a huge red flag. I've been tracking ASF for years through Russia, through Eastern Europe. It jumped to the Eurasian subcontinent in 2008. It's been bouncing around Russia. It's been bouncing all over Eastern Europe, and now it's into Western Europe in Belgium. And so this is something we've wrote about, talked about for years, ASF. And so when we see ASF hit China, that was a big red flag that China's probably not going to be able to deal with it. The hard part of analyzing it is you get mixed signals, and there's all kinds of information out there. And you can see this slide. There's all kinds of different stories. In China, it's still largely media lockdown. You don't find things published on ASF in China. You don't tweet about it, or WeChat is their social media. You don't put WeChat and talk about ASF or pig diseases in China. There are people that have been arrested for that. And so when I go to China and I talk to Chinese nationals, they're very hesitant. They're very bashful to talk about it. Most of them will say, well, we don't really have pig diseases in China. They'll tell me stuff like that. One, because I'm an American and they're a Chinese national, and maybe it has something to do with the trade war and loyalty, but it's very hard to get information. The people that will talk to you in China, they may know their experience with ASF, but there's not a lot of movement of people and news around China. So in the north, they really don't have a good feel for what's happening in the south, or maybe even the next province. They can say, here's how our province is doing, but it's very difficult to get information. And then you have things that complicate it, like the Chinese government came out a month ago and said, we have ASF under control in China. They've reported very few outbreaks. They just reported an outbreak yesterday, a small farm. But we know that the outbreaks are widely unreported. Probably less than 3% of outbreaks have ever been reported in China. And the big indication is when it hit Vietnam that we were able to see how bad it really does spread. So, half the world's pigs, Chinese pork consumption is 20% of the global protein market. And by that I mean beef, pork, and poultry. The world's beef, pork, and poultry, 20% of that is pork. And so think about what that means. This is not going to just impact pork, and it's not just going to impact China. It's going to roll through the global protein sector. It's going to elevate prices over the long term for all global proteins. And the virus is completely out of control in China, even still today. So this map shows the actual official outbreaks. These are the outbreaks that China's reported. It's spread now into Mongolia, into Vietnam, into Cambodia, into North Korea. But you look at those outbreaks across China, that's half the world's pigs, and then that virus jumps into Vietnam. Now, China thus far, I think, has reported around 138 different outbreaks. Vietnam reported 550 farms in the first 6 weeks. This has been going on in China since August, and they've reported 138 cases. And so on Vietnam, you see those red clusters. They probably stick out 6 inches off the page if they were stacked on top of each other. And so that gave us a real good view of how bad it really is when we saw the Vietnamese actually report cases. It's a unique structure in China. It's heavily backyard. You can see here, they only list 27% of the inventory as backyard, but take a look at the scale on those charts. That big red bar, those are what they call specialized farms, meaning 50 to 1,000 head per farm. So another way to look at this is 85% of China's hogs live on a farm of less than 1,000 head. Now that may not be what they call backyard, but in the U.S. we'd probably call that backyard. So 85%, and so there's been discussion that, well, the government will support the big farms, they'll get biosecure and expand, the small farms will go away, backyard will go out of business. That's not going to work in China. That's not going to, I mean, the backyard farms are 85% of the inventory. You look at the big mega farms, the Wen's Group and Muyan and those big corporate producers, those are 8% of China's production. You cannot build enough barns or pour enough concrete for them to offset the other 92% of the industry. And so without the small farms, China will not have pork. And so this is a big dilemma, and it's a dilemma in China. The conference I went to recently, there was an official from the Ministry of Agriculture, and you could just, I mean, I'm listening through a translator, but in his words, you could hear the fear in his message of how concerned they are that farmers are not coming back. They did a survey, the Ministry of Agriculture did, and the survey said that 80% of ASF outbreak farmers will not return to hog farming. Now that's not too big a surprise when you have to wait 6 months, find some money, restock, cross your fingers, and hope you don't get it again. And the virus has been around long enough, we're actually seeing some of those depopulated farms repopulate and break the second time. I had a group of people around the table in China, and I said, can anyone tell me a success story of a repopulated farm? No comment, right? It was just silence. And so I've heard of farms that are breaking the second time, and not only do they break with ASF, that kind of breaks your spirit and your will to live. You know, you're not going to, it's hard to keep rolling into the market when that happens.
So Brett, is the Chinese government, are you aware of the Chinese government trying to assist them in repopulating, financially assist or provide any kind of backstop for it, or is that an unknown?
Yeah, no, they're talking about it. Just recently, I think a week or two ago, I think it was last week, the Chinese government came out and they basically said, you provincial governments need to provide financing to these guys. Now, you guys are bankers. How much money would you want to loan farmers that have zero land collateral, they don't own their land, and they have probably better than 50% chance the repopulated hogs are going to get this disease and they're all going to die too?
That'd be a tough sell.
It's a tough sell for a banker, right? And so nobody wants to pay for it, I think, is what's going on. The central government's saying this is a provincial problem, you guys need to find the money. The provinces don't have big budgets. And that's one reason that compensation hasn't really been paid in China for reporting outbreaks. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell, and I don't think anyone really wants to spend the money to do that.
Right.
So, here's my 3 reasons why I think this is not going away. Now, some people say, oh, it's going to take China 5 years to rebuild or 8 years to rebuild. Under the current situation with no vaccine, honestly, I don't see a way that they ever rebuild. I don't know how you can have any confidence in a system. One, you have a virus that's almost impossible to kill. You have a hog industry that all shares infrastructure. They share trucks, they share feed mills, they share packing plants. And yeah, they're working on that. They're trying to certify feed mills and testing feed and trying to get some clean feed mills. But they are so far away from really being able to truck in new gilts. How do you certify those gilts? You're shipping out your piglets. You're bringing trucks back and forth. They don't. They haven't developed the infrastructure to clean trucks like we have. I just look at this, and then you've got the government with a total lack of transparency. They're not reporting it. They're not collaborating with each other. They're not sharing information, trying to figure out what works. And under that scenario, until there's a vaccine, I don't see how this ever goes away. I don't think China ever returns to the levels of hogs that they had a year ago. And the vaccine is the silver bullet, but, you know, everybody I talk to say it's 5 years at best. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to have a vaccine in 5 years. That means the best long shot odds are possibly in 5 years. Now, there have been researchers trying to develop a vaccine for decades for ASF. No one's been able to crack that nut yet. And so that's a pretty tough strategy to say we're just going to hope for a vaccine. I think this changes the entire global structure of pork for decades. So, what's really happened? To this point, millions of hogs are gone. I say millions, probably well over 100 million, maybe 200 million. Who knows, right? We have no idea. But we know that the China Swine Association reported in some provinces 60% of the hogs are gone. They said nationally, clear back in February, they said nationally they estimated 30% of the hogs were gone. We're adding up hundreds of millions of hogs. The key to understanding this ASF in China, though, and this is important because it changes the timing of everything, the hogs were not all burned and buried, and you probably saw videos of that. Those were the government-reported cases. When the government came in, they took all the hogs, healthy or sick, burned and buried the hogs. Now, I told you that was only 138 cases so far. The Chinese government back in February said that was 900,000 hogs. Well, if we're talking 150-plus million hogs, you got to understand most of those hogs were slaughtered. They were not burned and buried. And to understand that, you've got to see how this virus works. So if we have 100 hogs in a pen, if you look at the top virus up there, or the top chart, those are 199 healthy pigs and 1 infected pig. Now you fast forward 10 days, those are 3 different outcomes of 3 different diseases. On the left is foot and mouth disease. In 10 days, 100% of the herd has been infected and 2 hogs have died. The center disease on the bottom, there's classical swine fever. You can see what happens there. 50–60% of the hogs are infected and about 25% of the hogs have died. Now ASF on this chart doesn't look too bad. It's on the right. So in 10 days, only 10% of the hogs have even been infected, and only 9 of those hogs have died. But you do the math, that's a 90% mortality rate. So the virus moves slow. That's the important thing to understand here. You have a slow-moving virus, which that changes what's happened in China. If you're a farmer and you go out and you have 3 dead pigs, well, first you'll have 3 sick pigs. 3 days later, 4 days later, you'll have 3 dead pigs. That's a pretty strong signal. Get rid of everything. The fact that this moves slow means that all these farmers were able to market their hogs, or almost all of their hogs. Most of the hogs that are lost in China are not lost. They went through packing plants. And so it wasn't millions of hogs being buried out in the country. It was millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of hogs going through the processing sector. And in China, that processing sector has been under capacity for decades. There are plants that have never run over 50% capacity. But you figure out, as you see some of the results of these publicly traded companies, you can see what happened. These hogs were slaughtered. They weren't cold and burned. Zhangbang, one of the biggest hog companies in China, they reported Jan through April sales up 45%. April was up 78%. March was up 75%. That was in their publicly available documents. And so you can see what happened here. As producers got scared, they sold everything. If you broke with ASF, not only you, but probably all your neighbors would sell their hogs because they all buy their hogs and feed at the same place you do. And so we just pushed all those hogs through the system. The Shanghai group, slaughter up 21% in Q1. And so the lost hogs are not lost. Those hogs are still there, and most of them are still in frozen form. Think about this. Here's a theoretical slaughter chart. I have no data to support this, but I'm just showing you this theoretically. If you look and say, here's a calendar year, and maybe this is how it happened in China, you have slaughter rates up 40% for the first 3 months. Eventually, they're going to run out of hogs, and those slaughter rates are going to fall sharply. You look at that chart and say, what's the annual production loss? Well, the annual production loss may not be that big on a calendar year basis that looks like this, but the production is going to be sitting in inventory. Now, the Chinese processors, they knew what was going on. When they saw that massive increase in hog slaughter, they realized there are going to be shortages ahead. And so their natural instinct was hoard everything. Build coolers, find cold storage, put everything you can in storage because this pork is going to turn into gold when the shortages hit. And so I believe that there are massive inventories of frozen pork in China, millions of tons of frozen pork because of that heavy slaughter. And what does that do? That moves the gap further out into our future. Now, for the last 6-8 months, up until about April, my thoughts were that this gap's going to start to hit the market in mid-2019, which is about where we are today. But I was over in China last month. I talked to meat importers, traders. I went to a producer meeting, and all of the buzz was the disease is still raging. It's raging in the south. It hit the north first. So in the south, they're still heavily slaughtering. The slaughter rates are very high. Pork is abundant. The prices are lower. And there's also a massive inventory waiting. And so that pushes our expectations of when these prices run higher, it pushes those a little further out into the future. That's important as you're thinking about the futures market and the reaction. Now here's just some numbers on math. Now 2018 and 2019 are the transition years. That's the big wacky calendar year that it's going to be hard to assess what the losses were. We don't know how many pigs there are in China. No one on earth knows that. USDA estimates it, and so the only number we have is a USDA estimate that said January 2018 they had 44 million sows, 433 million total inventory. Now the Ministry of Agriculture said sows are now down 21%. That says 9 million fewer sows. That's more sows than there are in North America, US, Canada, Mexico combined. That 9 million fewer sows means there's going to be 158 million fewer pigs born this year. Total hogs were down 20%. China Swine Association said 30% of the hogs are already gone. So we do the math, and I don't know where we land in 2019, but by 2020, we're going to be down at least 245 million hogs in China, at least 36% lower. It won't be smaller than that, and it could be much larger. Now, those numbers are staggering. When we flip over and switch that and talk about pork, those are the hog side. Let's look at pork. A 30% loss of 54.5 million tons, that's a 16 million ton shortfall. That's on a carcass weight basis. On a shipped weight basis, it's 12 million tons. They're 12 million tons short. Well, they imported 2.8 million tons last year. I think they'll get up around 4 million tons maybe this year. That says they're still 8 million tons short on a shipped weight basis. That's an incredible amount. Global pork exports, all exports from all countries worldwide last year was 8 million tons. That means they would have to buy every pound from Japan, Korea, Europe, and everybody that was traded to fill that gap. We know that that's not an option. That's not reasonable. So what this means, bottom line, is someone's going to go without pork in China. You simply cannot make it up. So what about beef and poultry? Beef's not a good substitute. While China has 88 pounds of pork per person, they only have about 14 pounds of beef per person. They have 20 pounds of poultry. Now that's supply and demand. You can't make that up quickly. Beef costs 3 times the price of pork, 3.5 times, and beef prices are almost record high. They hit a record high in February. Beef demand is phenomenal. It's a new item. It's a restaurant item. It's kind of the new thing, and it's really for the wealthy in China. Poultry, if you look closely at that chart, you can see we just saw record high poultry prices. 20 pounds of poultry available versus 88 pounds of pork. The math doesn't work. I mean, they'll expand poultry, they'll try to, but their flock has aged. They've banned the import of breeding stock chicks since 2015. For years, the Chinese poultry industry has been telling me, we think we're going to see reduced production because of the aging breeding flock. So poultry's not a good answer. Broiler chicks, last week, the price of broiler chicks in China was up 87% from a year ago. What that means is the way they're allocating broiler chicks in China is probably with fist fights. You can't find them. You cannot get your hands on broiler chicks. Big farms, hog farms are trying to fill their barns with broiler chicks. Not a bad strategy if you can find them, but there's just not enough. So here's what China's supplies look like. There's pork supplies, production and imports, chicken and beef. That orange box, that's 16 million ton shortage. Again, this is a carcass weight equivalent. You can see there's no good answer. You're not going to ramp up production or imports to even cover half of that. Just not an option. U.S. poultry remains banned. They banned us in 2015 over bird flu. We still have that ban in place. We can't ship poultry to China today. So there's the per cap numbers. You can see how significant pork is over beef and poultry. So let's move around the world. So China's half the hogs in the world. Europe's 25%. Europe's also battling ASF. So right now we have 75% of the world's swine herd at risk of African swine fever. Here you can see in Europe where it is. Now those green dots, those are wild boars. The problem with Europe is wild boars, and it probably is in China. China's only reported a few wild boar cases, but there are wild boars all over China, all over Europe. The Europeans are aggressively testing, hunting, trapping, doing everything they can do to try and slow the spread through wild boars. And the problem is, if you're familiar with wild boars in the U.S., you're surrounded and outnumbered, right? You cannot, there aren't enough bullets in America to shoot all the wild pigs in the South, and it's the same story in Europe. And so they're fighting that front. Now, the big fear was that virus jumped 600 miles to Belgium. They think it may have went through some military movements with food or some kind of products in the military that carried that out. With wild boars, they eat garbage. It's just difficult to really stop. Belgium's experience has been they find a wild boar, they build a quarantine zone, and the virus keeps jumping the quarantine zones. And so they keep expanding the quarantine zones, they keep finding more wild boars. Now, the big scary thing, and we'll talk about it a little more, is what if we find it here? It's hard to think about, right? But here's Belgium's experience. So those green dots are Belgium's domestic hog farms. They found ASF in probably the best possible region, as far as you can get from their swine sector. They find a wild boar, they build a quarantine zone, and just to make sure the trading partners are comfortable, they said this was a wild boar, we built a quarantine zone, and we killed every domestic hog in the quarantine zone. And we didn't process them. We killed them, buried them, burned them, made sure they never entered the food chain, just so you can be assured that we don't have this in our pork. As a result, every country in the world banned Belgian pork exports. They can only ship within the EU, under the EU agreement. And they're aggressively begging, pleading, sharing information, trying to get Japan, Korea, these markets to reopen. They export all over the world. Thus far, they've been successful with Vietnam and India. Those are the two countries that the Belgians told me have said, we would buy your pork if we had a good reason. We're not going to ban you. But they really don't buy any Belgian pork. And so that's the scary thing, is there is no mercy from other countries if you find yourself in the unfortunate spot of having ASF. Everyone bans you, whether they need to or not. That's been the Belgian experience. So what about North America? Right now we're exporting about 23% of our production. Canada exports 70% of their production. An ASF outbreak would initially close virtually all markets. The U.S. and Canada now have an agreement to regionalize. Mexico may be willing to regionalize. I don't know, we'd see. But the Asians would close, and especially the Asian markets that don't have it. But think about China. So China has ASF. They're facing pork shortages. ASF jumps from China to Mongolia. The next day, China bans all Mongolian pork. They've also banned Vietnamese pork. So just keep that in mind. Just because somebody has it doesn't mean they're going to not ban you. The bans would be rampant. I don't know if any of you lived through the BSE, mad cow disease. Every country on earth banned U.S. beef overnight for one imported dairy cow that never went through the food chain. It took years to get those markets open. So that's terrifying. I mean, that's the scary side of this. Now,
so Brett,
go ahead.
Yeah, one of the questions on Vietnam then was the prices in China. Is there pork getting through the back channels yet?
Back channels Vietnam into China?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of been a poorly kept secret in South China. There's a lot of flow of Vietnamese pork into China, both pork and live hogs. They estimated a few years, I was down on the Vietnam border, they estimated about 50,000 hogs a day were coming across from Vietnam. They ship those hogs all over China. A guy told me one time he was at a slaughterhouse in Shanghai and they were killing Vietnamese hogs in Shanghai, which makes no sense. That's a long haul, right? But yeah, that border is very porous. And so how does China contain this? How does Vietnam contain this? You've got workers, feed, and hogs all crossing the border illegally. Pretty tough, right?
We have an interesting question on the chat, which maybe
Sure.
we're going to get to, and that's about, we're still buying pork from Poland.
Good question. Yeah, good comment. We are. We're still buying pork from Poland. Now, I said most of those cases have been wild boars. So the USDA has said we're going to regionalize and we're going to take the high road. We're going to import from your regions that are clean because we want people to treat us that way. I'm skeptical that anyone will buy that if it ever happens here. But just last week, a big Polish hog farm, domestic farm, broke with ASF. That's troubling. So this virus is spreading. It's in Poland. USDA's designated ASF-free areas. I think there's some risk there, right? You look at the flow of goods and services around the world. We ship most of our sausage casings to China to be cleaned and processed. They return those back to us. That's happening every week, even today. We're bringing in our hog casings that have been to China. Sounds like an odd thing to do, but it makes economic sense. And so, yeah, we're importing feed additives from China. lysine, choline, vitamin E, some of those feed additives. Now, we're getting better. I think the fear of ASF has prompted some real action in our industry. We're trying to mitigate those risks as best we can. We're holding longer inventories, trying to let the virus deactivate. I think as time goes on, maybe that's good for us from the feed standpoint. We're probably reducing the risk. The problem is this virus is spreading globally. We have people circling the globe every day. We have equipment, goods, people, tourists, sausage transiting the earth. They've found ASF in 5 foreign airports. Now, we haven't found it here. I've talked to Customs Border Protection. They said, we never will find it here. And I said, why is that? And they said, when we find sausage, we incinerate it. We don't test it. So maybe it's been here. We don't know. But we're putting a lot of faith and trust in this system. We need to all be vigilant. We need to continue to encourage these agencies to do their best. You know, we got more funding. The industry got more funding for more beagles in airports to sniff out sausage. I've been to China 3 times. I've never seen a beagle yet in the airport coming home. There aren't beagles in every airport. I've drug luggage home from China 3 times this year, and I've never seen a beagle in the airport. So it's not in every airport, and it's not everywhere. I'm a little disheartened. I don't see signs and placards in the gate areas in China. I think we ought to have placards up that say, here's the U.S. law, here's the U.S. fine. I hope we can make some progress there. I was in the Bogota, Colombia airport the other day, and right in the baggage claim area before you clear the quarantine, there was a big ASF sign with a pig on it. The Colombians are doing that. But yeah, we all need to be vigilant. We need to push on these agencies. We need to do everything we can do. ASF would wreak havoc on our markets. We could not eat our way out of that mess if we were to lose our export markets. So yeah, that's scary. I think the risk is low. I think it's actually very low that we get it. Now, long term, fast forward 10 years, 15 years, this virus probably ends up everywhere just because there's no vaccine and it's spreading globally and people travel a lot. And so I think ultimately you run the models, any disease outbreak model would suggest that this virus ends up on every continent. But hopefully, if that's the case, we want to be the last country to get it, right? We want this to happen 20 years from now, not next year. So I've got a few slides on the U.S. pork exports. You can see here I call this a forecast. It's probably more of a guess than a forecast. But you can kind of see where my mind is. This is exports year over year quarterly. The first quarter we were down 5%. I've got a little bit of a gain building in second quarter, a little bigger gain in third quarter, and fourth quarter is where I see the big opportunity. Again, that's a guess. I mean, they're still slaughtering hogs aggressively in southern China right now. And so those supplies are still big, at least in the south. Now, the weekly hog data showed last week a bit of a jump, the biggest 1-week jump in Chinese hog prices in 10 weeks. It wasn't a big jump, but at least the trends reversed. And if you look at the regions, it was in the north and northeast. Those first regions to get ASF, they're starting to see their prices go up. The south, the southwest, Sichuan province, those big areas that are supposedly battling the virus, their prices went down last week. That makes sense. And so I think as we follow those regional prices, until the southern prices stabilize and start to go up, maybe that's our first signal that, hey, this thing's for real. Now, when those prices take off, keep in mind they still have some inventory. It's going to take a little time. There's my pork export forecast by country. Mexico moved lower last year. That was the first year in, 10 years that we saw Mexico decline. I think Mexico declines again, especially if we send this much pork to China. Mexico's going to have a harder time buying those hams if we're shipping potentially carcasses to China. We have some weekly data. We have a few indicators. This is the weekly pork export sales data. This is reported by exporters. It's not the weight of pork crossing the scales. It's not actual data. And it's actually horribly underreported. But this is what we have. The exporters that do report to the export sales systems they've now booked 170,000 tons for China. Booked means they've ordered it, but not yet shipped it. So it's sold, not yet shipped. So that's how much pork is sitting on the books somewhere that the Chinese have said they will buy that they have not yet taken delivery on. The problem with that data, here it is if we compare the actual customs data of what we sent to China last year, the weekly sales in that weekly data is only 27% of the actual. So what I'm saying here is most of the pork going to China is not reported in the export sales system. Now, I've had the tough talk with USDA that this is a disservice to our industry. We need to get it fixed. Under law, you are required by law to report these exports, but the system doesn't, it's not enforced. So what I'm saying here is when we get that weekly data every Thursday, you'll see the weekly export sales data. Be very careful. In total, only 58% of our actual exports are being reported in that data set. The market trades that data. Thursday, the futures market will trade this weekly data, but be careful. It's not the big picture yet. Here's my forecast of pork exports to China, Hong Kong. Again, you can see I'm kind of looking out into that September, October time frame as being the big opportunity. That being said, who knows, right? I wouldn't be surprised if we had bigger shipments going today than we realize. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a big jump in August. This is a big guess right now. It's the biggest guess in the world of when these shipments happen. We've got the orders booked. We've got Chinese interest. We have tariffs, but I'm hearing that a lot of those government orders going to China are not paying the tariffs anyway. We have a potential trade deal coming. Who knows? We throw the politics into the mix and it gets really complicated. There's the China daily hog price. That's January through yesterday. We track those daily hog prices closely. Here you can see, remember the big jump in the futures market in March? There's the hog price. Here's August live hog futures. That hog future move up, that was right in line with that Chinese hog price. But while the hog price has stabilized, the futures have fallen. And so this is a story, it's kind of a story that for speculation to continue in the futures market, you've got to be throwing gas on the fire every week. And we can go weeks without anything out of China, total radio silence. When there's no news on it, the futures gets a little bored with it, starts to doubt, and retracts. And so this is going to be volatile. There will be news come out, the hog price will run up, the futures price will run up. It'll get quiet, this futures price will fall. We've seen it, right? A lot of limit up, limit down days. That's going to be the world we live in, probably for at least the next year and maybe years to come. Incredible volatility. So what about the politics? The U.S. trade war with China, the talks are at an impasse. China backed away, the U.S. pulled away. The June 15th, Trump has said his 10% duties on half of Chinese imports go from 10% to 25%. That's this week. 10% duties on half of Chinese imports have hurt the Chinese economy. The president's also said on June 28th, after the G20 summit in Tokyo, after his meeting with President Xi, he's going to make the decision whether to put 25% tariffs on an additional $300 billion of Chinese imports. What has hurt the Chinese economy, if this all goes through, is going to be very punitive. They'll have 25% duties on virtually everything they send. That's tough. The Chinese PMI index, the manufacturing index, went negative last month for the first time in a long time. We're driving investors away from China. Anyone who's sourcing raw materials out of China right now is saying, what's plan B? Can we move to Vietnam? Can we produce it here? Can we do something so we don't have to deal with this? And so this is a lot of pressure, and China knows this. They know that 25% duties are going to be unbearable on their economy. So I say this is a high-stakes negotiation. It will be very interesting to see what comes out of the Japan talks on the 28th. I would not be surprised if we come out of those talks, maybe not with a deal, but with an agreement to start talking again. I think the Chinese want to kick the can down the road as far as they can, hold off on tariffs. They may commit and say, look, we're open to talks, let's reopen talks, hold off on your duties, and then they're going to stall as long as they can there. This really has been a stall since November. November was the tariff threat, right? And they've been able to hold it off this long. They're going to try and keep doing that. But there's enormous pressure. If the president says we're going ahead with duties, there's a lot of pressure on China. There's our ag exports to China. The trade war, cost us $10 billion in soybean sales last year to China. That hurts, right? That made a difference. About $8 billion actually, but the reality is China hasn't really opened to U.S. agriculture. They play games with grains, DDGs, hay, pork, beef, poultry. Everything has a game with China, outside of soybeans, which they needed. And so we'll see. We'll see where that goes. Here's our year-to-date change in pork exports. The big story is actually Mexico. But the big story is really our top 4 markets are all lower for 4 different reasons. Mexico, they've seen higher prices. They've seen competition from China for some of that pork. Japan, we're now at a disadvantage. Every one of our competitors has a better trade deal because of the TPP agreement and the European Free Trade Agreement. China, Hong Kong, we've had friction, crackdowns in Hong Kong. We haven't been able to send as much. Korea, there's been expansion. They've expanded their herd. Their sow numbers are now about as high as they've been. And the year-over-year prices are starting to fall a little below what they were a year ago. The farm price, the wholesale price, the retail price, all those prices have moved a little lower on pork in Korea due to bigger supplies. There's our Mexican price, and I run this price. I just show the Mexican hog price is the green line. This is all in pesos per kilo, so this is their price. Then I run U.S. hams, just the U.S. ham price converted into pesos per kilo. And then I run that ham price with 20% duties, and I even threw 5% duties on when we thought we may have a risk of retaliation. But look at that price today, even the blue line. There's our ham price. Right now we have no duties going to Mexico. That ham price is expensive. And so that's part of the reason we've seen those lower exports into Mexico. So here's just a snapshot of those big top markets that were now below a year ago. 18 to 19, you can see there, Japan, we're shipping a lot less than we sent a year ago. Or Mexico. Japan, you can see a slight decline. China, Hong Kong, pretty volatile. Korea, Canada. Now, if you look, China, Hong Kong is about 35,000 tons a month. Take a look at this next chart. I went and pulled all of our recent free trade agreements. These are the countries we've recently had free trade agreements. I say recent, maybe over the last decade. Australia was a little longer than that. But these are places where we send pork duty-free, no tariffs. We're sending about the equivalent to those 4 groups right there as we send to China, Hong Kong right now. The growth rate's incredible. You add up these populations, it's incredible what the U.S. can do with duty-free access. And this shows you the importance of those free trade agreements. Korea's under a free trade agreement. We're shipping more than we have for years to Korea. Canada's duty-free, Mexico's duty-free, but these are kind of the new duty-free markets. Pretty impressive growth. We've sent, what do we send to Australia? 30 million pounds in April. We sent 50 million to China in April. Pretty big markets, and so I think you'll talk about markets of the future. Basically, anywhere we can send pork duty-free, we're going to compete very well in.
So, Brett, as important as Mexico and Mexican imports have been, and the growth of Mexican imports have been, so are they replacing that protein with pork from other sources, or are they consuming different protein?
That's a good question. So, yeah, they've opened a quota for European pork. They've said, we'll open a quota duty-free for non-U.S. suppliers because of the trade war. Almost zero pork has come in from any other country except Canada. So the trade war hits. We have 20% tariffs on U.S. hams. Canada's zero. So we saw there for about a year, about 8 months, Canada sent a lot of hams to Mexico because of the tariff advantage. Now that's over. We've lost our tariffs. They're not putting those on now. But no European pork really has come to Mexico. I would say that's been offset by domestic production.
They've continued to grow their production.
Yeah, they continue to grow production and big-scale commercial hog farms. They've done the same thing in the cattle side. They build a lot of feedlots. They're developing their industry. So when we see that Mexico market turn south, that's a little bit concerning. Yeah, they've had higher prices, but also I think they've expanded their base. Okay, I'll wrap it up here. Just kind of a watch list. I think we've hit all these. The things I'm watching very closely, I'm watching the daily China live hog price. We put out an alert every Monday morning. Here's what's going on ASF. Here's the China hog prices nationally, regionally, and give our thoughts there. That's something we've got to watch very closely. Watch for further spreading. South Korea is at enormous risk of ASF. It's now in North Korea. I think North Korea is just a speed bump before it gets into South Korea. I think the Philippines are at risk. Thailand is at risk. We're going to see continued spreading. Chinese buyers are in the market. They've been booking orders. They're actively booking and preparing. I think everybody's on pins and needles in China waiting for the signal. That signal will be higher prices. Once that's done, we've got U.S. packers that are gearing up to send a lot of pork to China. Again, timing's everything. I don't know if it's this month, next month, or this fall, but the deal is for real. ASF is for real. Now it's just a matter of trying to figure out the timing. Trade policy, watch this week. We'll see what happens when those tariffs get ratcheted up on the 15th. We'll also see what happens on the 28th, if President Xi and President Trump start talking again, or if this becomes a protracted trade war. If so, the tariffs go on, and that will be very punitive to the Chinese economy. I don't think it affects us a lot on the pork side, other than it makes it tough to get pork over the 50% threshold into China. I think any protein, any commodity with exposure to this China ASF situation, watch it closely. All protein markets globally are going to be affected. We haven't even talked about soybeans. China consumes 30% of the world's soybean supply. If they lose half their hogs, that has a soybean implication, right? And so this story's not over. In fact, it's just getting going, and there's going to be big changes ahead. With that, I'll wind it up. We can take questions, comments, thoughts here. Anything else that
this will be a tough one, but you talked about the amount of cold storage or frozen pork in China. Would you venture to take a guess at how many days of supply that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, the Chinese government would say that's a state secret. And if you poke around and try to solve it, they'll say that you're committing espionage. Now, I poked around and tried to solve it. I was asking everybody I could find in China, how much pork is there? I talked to traders at the Seattle Food Show, Europeans, Brazilians, Chinese importers, Chinese government importers. I had meetings for 2 weeks all over China. The story was kind of the same. Now, this was a month ago, 3 weeks ago. The story was, I had guys say there's probably 5 million tons. I had guys say there's 10 million tons. So say it's 8 to 10 million tons. Now, that's an incredible amount of cold storage. I would not have believed that before this trip, but I think it's viable. I think it's possible. The Chinese are fantastic speculators, and if they know what's going on, they will move heaven and earth to make money on it. So say there's 8 to 10 million tons. China consumes 54 million tons a year. You go, okay, that's about 1/6, right? 1/5, 1/6, 20, 30%. What is that, 6 weeks? So that says if production went to zero, they would have 6 weeks. Now, production may only be down, production may actually be up right now. But say production starts to drop 10, 20, 30% a month, that inventory could ration out a long time. Now, the private companies will hoard it. If the prices go up, they're not going to sell 1 pound of inventory. They're going to hold it as long as they can. But the government will try to use that to stabilize prices. So that makes this timing thing even more complicated.
Exactly.
So what percent is government controlled versus company controlled?
Yeah, good question. On the inventory, frozen inventory, how much is government controlled? I guess you could argue that all of it is ultimately, because if the government goes in and says, hey, this is a national issue, we're going to take your inventory, or we're going to tell you when you can and cannot sell it, that could happen, right? They could do that in China. I heard some numbers, I don't know, maybe half of that is possibly held by the Chinese government or state-owned enterprises today, maybe half of the inventory. But I would imagine they're still growing it. I imagine they're still trying to find places to put pork and expand that. All right, any other comments, questions?
I think we've covered off on the questions that we've got. So, again, on behalf of Compeer Financial, we greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your day today to join us, and want to thank you, Brett, again for being here and your experience and sharing what you know with our group. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kent. Appreciate it. Appreciate the Compeer group for putting this together. Hopefully this is of value to the group today.
Absolutely. Bet.